Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing, and we are currently in chapter 45. So let me bring that up. I noticed I didn't update the chapter number. So this should be 45, not 44. But let's go ahead and start with the text here. Great accomplishment seems unfinished, but its use is continuous. Great fullness seems empty, but in use is inexhaustible. Great straightness seems bent. Great skill seems clumsy. Great eloquence seems mute. Now, this was from our core text that we normally use, Addiss and Lombardo. I'm going to do the conclusion of this in a different translation from Ellen Chin. But for this first part, I just want to kind of pause and see if you have some thoughts on what you think is going on here. So we've got, great accomplishment seems unfinished, but its use is continuous. Great fullness seems empty, but its use is inexhaustible.
It seems maybe there's a connection between the idea of perfection and the idea of completedness, as in something that's perfected is considered complete, whereas something that's not perfected is not complete, is still growing, changing, evolving.
I like that. So there's, to kind of expand on that, then would you say that there's a value in not being complete because then it can still continue? Is that along the lines of what you're saying?
Yeah, I'd say that's resonant. Also, in the Feng in the English version, the verse is great accomplishment seems imperfect, yet does not outlive its usefulness.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what gives me that idea.
Gotcha. There's a couple of prior passages that had some similar ideas that were brought up. One of them had to do with a cup being over full. The implication being if it's not full, you can actually still use it. And then there is this idea of the bellows that seems empty, but it allows for this continuous flow of air that kind of bring in similar concepts to what we're seeing here. And I think that kind of fits a little bit with the direction you were going, Dane. Anybody else have some thoughts on this?
I think gratefulness seems empty, but in use is inexhaustible. Kind of feels like the atmosphere or oxygen. We're just always breathing, but
It seems empty.
Yeah, it seems empty. Like if you were out in the desert with nothing around, you're like, it's so empty here, but you're breathing. So
Yeah. So let me read through this, the first couple of lines here again, and see if you notice anything that is a commonality. Great accomplishment seems unfinished, but its use is continuous. Great fullness seems empty, but its in use is inexhaustible. Great straightness seems bent. Great skill seems clumsy. And great eloquence seems mute. Did you notice any?
So they're clearly pushing at opposites here. But what comes to mind for me is whenever you have like an expert in a craft, then they make that craft look simple and easy, even though it's not.
So there's a term that's getting repeated in each of these lines. Did anybody catch what that is?
Seems.
Mm-hmm.
Appears to be.
Yeah. So every single line, there's this idea that something seems one way, but it's another. So one of the things that I think we need to pick up from that is that there's an issue with perception. We're not seeing things clearly. We're seeing things from a particular expectation, maybe. So this could be, I think, approached from two different directions. One, that we've been given a sense of false expectations of what should be. And this would fall into the kind of that Wu Wei category where we've fallen prey to socially constructed ideas of what's supposed to be. Or it could also be referring to, and maybe not exclusively, maybe both of these come into play, is that we are simply limited in our ability to perceive. So I suspect if Lao Tzu or whoever wrote this had the information that we do about the distinction between what appears as a sunrise and what actually is in terms of the rotation of the earth, that would probably come into play here too. It appears or it seems as though the sun is rising, but actually it's the earth that's turning. So there's this seems part of it that really comes into play, this perception that is distorted either because of our lack of ability to grasp or see the full picture, or because we've fallen prey to false expectations about what's supposed to be. So this creates kind of an interesting dilemma for us, because if we can't have the big picture, if we can't know everything about anything, then we have to somehow figure out how do we move forward with our partial understanding or our partial perception. And one of the things, well, if maybe I'll pause for just a second and see if taking this into consideration, the issue of perspective or perception, adds anything to what you're thinking about these first couple of verses here.
I'm just confused on why those things seem that way. Like, if you've accomplished something, then why is it unfinished? It doesn't accomplishment mean that it's done?
Well,
and doesn't fullness seem full, I would assume? I don't know. I'm confused by that.
so this would be kind of like you need to flip it around the other way, in the sense of something great was accomplished, but when you look at it, you think it's unfinished. Right? Because it seems unfinished to you, right? My perception perceives it as unfinished, but maybe in fact it is actually a great accomplishment. And in that seeming to be unfinished, there's this idea that there's this use that's actually continuous. So if we think about the Tao as this combination of things where there's like this oneness, this patterns of things, and this movement from absence to presence, in a sense, that entirety of what we might call the universe would be like a great accomplishment in a kind of anthropomorphic sense, but we can approach it as though it's not finished. And so we might look at nature as not where it's supposed to be, that we have to do something to fix it or bring it to its completion. And that's going to be maybe a misperception of that great accomplishment of what actually is, but we're driven to a different type of action because we're seeing it as something other. We're seeing it as unfinished. The great fullness, again, we could think of it from this perspective of how do we look at the natural world, can seem empty. There's something missing. There's something that we have to do, right? So there's this ongoing drive because of our imperception. So because of whatever is limiting our perception, or because we've inherited this view from culture, then when we're looking out, we're seeing things as unfinished, we're seeing them as empty, we're seeing them as bent, we're seeing them as clumsy, and we're seeing them as mute. So this creates a situation where we need to do something, right? That there is a task before us, or it could be that there's this issue of anxiety because everything is in a state of disarray, and we need to somehow figure out how to bring some kind of order to it. So the question then is, if we're seeing this the wrong way, and it's causing us to behave in certain ways because of this false perception, then what happens if we correct our vision, or if we work on expanding our perception to take more things into account? But there's the other part of this, which is, especially in these first two, right? So there's this great accomplishment. And I think we can look at this in terms of these two lines being in reference to Tao, because it's a similar kind of phrasing that gets used in other passages where it's inexhaustible. There's this continuous accessibility. So the idea of it seeming like it's empty, but it's actually inexhaustible, or the idea that it's a continuously flowing or something's available, gives us a little bit of that reality that's behind it, even though to us it seems like it's unfinished and empty. And then the following ones are just kind of playing up on that same thing again, that there's still this misperception. We think it's bent, we think it's clumsy, we think it's mute, when in fact there's great skill, straightness, stillness, and eloquence.
Jim, I can think of literal interpretations for all these, as well as a more abstract interpretation for all of them, starting with the first one, accomplishment seeming empty or seeming imperfect. But if, in a sense, if something was actually perfect, it would be finished and then no longer growing or evolving or changing, and therefore not perfect. And the second one, there's examples that have been mentioned of things that are useful because they're empty, and if they were full, they would no longer be useful. On the second one, the great straightness seeming bent, there's actually, it's kind of the opposite with, the Greek columns, how they appear to be straight because they're so tall, but they're actually not straight. It's just it's a perspectival issue. And then great skill seeming clumsy is like when a performer, like a juggler, a stage artist or something, will intentionally drop the ball to make it look like they're not as skilled as they are, so that the audience will be more uncertain about the outcome. And of course, great eloquence seeming mute is sometimes the best time to say something is nothing. But if the best thing to say is nothing. But if it's about the nature of perception itself, that perception is inherently perspectival, meaning it's a projection. It's a lower dimensional projection of a multidimensional reality, or as Daniel Schmachtenberger says, if you're looking at the east side of a house, it means you're not looking at the west side. Or if you're looking at the inside of something, it means you're not looking at the outside. By the act of perceiving certain things, you're automatically not perceiving certain other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can only send our attention to one thing essentially at a time. Yeah. Yeah, it becomes interesting, right? There could be that mystification approach where maybe somebody's trying to obscure or, camouflage something, like making the great skill look like it's clumsy, or the same thing with the eloquence. Another interesting development within Chinese culture, evidently around these, is that there was a recognition that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. And so not to necessarily discount somebody who maybe seems like they're on the street, or that they can't speak well, or that maybe they don't move well, that these would be easy to go past in terms of there's nothing to see here, there's nothing to learn here, but perhaps there's a great deal of wisdom that can actually come from these individuals that would normally be not looked at in society. So that's another interesting direction that this passage has taken. So a couple of different ways then that we've seen that we can look at this. Where does the passage go? I'm taking a different translation for the last part of this because there's a significant change that can happen, and this is with most languages, in terms of how we use punctuation. And in classical Chinese, they don't actually use punctuation. So this is something that has to be supplied by the interpreter or the translator. And there's a much more simplified way that the next two lines read. In fact, Dane, I think, do you had that Feng in English translation in front of you? Yeah. So why don't you just read the next two lines real quick so we can see how those read, the ones about hot and cold.
Movement overcomes cold, stillness overcomes heat.
So we've got a what seems like fairly straightforward: movement overcomes cold, stillness overcomes heat. This, if we're thinking about these prior ones in terms of interesting opposites or ironic opposites, let's say, because there's this idea of seams, then the next two passages could fall in that category where move around and you're going to warm up if you're cold, or if you stay still, you'll cool off if you're hot, type of a thing. But those seem kind of obvious. But what's interesting is there's precedents in the past for how this has been translated, where there's a comma actually added after the idea of overcomes. And it brings out a whole different way of looking at these two lines that I'll show you now. When agitation wins, the cold arrives. When tranquility wins, the hot arrives. So here, what we're looking at in terms of that movement or agitation, in the prior translation, it has overcomes, which is definitely a way that that can be translated. But it's also this idea of like almost like a conquering, right? Like a winning, which is how they went with this translation here to bring out a little bit more of that point. And the idea is that when agitation reaches essentially like its zenith, or it gets to the maximal point, then what's going to happen is the converse. It's going to then bring about the cold, almost kind of like if we think about like that yin yang, or we could think about like a peak and a decline, or we could think about like a pendulum swinging back and forth, that when you get to that maximum, then it's going to swing back the other direction. So one of the concepts with this hot and cold can have to do with like the seasons. So let's say during the summer, or spring and summer, we've got all this activity and life is in full bloom, let's say. And so there's this movement that's happening, and when it kind of hits that peak, then it takes a turn, and then the cold comes in the terms of the winter. And in that winter, things slow down and become more tranquil, and when that meets its zenith, then it turns again, and the summer arrives, and we have the warmth, and life flourishes and begins again. So that would be more of a natural cycle that's coming into play. But there's this idea about like extremes that are being played here. When that agitation wins, when it conquers, when it overcomes, when it gets at that highest point, then there's a opposite reaction. So, and the same thing with the cold, or, with the tranquility. So then the bottom line then that's coming up here is that clear and tranquil. And this is interesting, the way that she has translated this line: clear and tranquil, the world is in the right mode. Now, does that mean that the world is always clear and tranquil? Or does it mean I have a sense of clarity and tranquility, that the world is in the right mode? Right? It can kind of go in a couple of different directions in terms of how we look at this line. I also want to bring a couple of other translations in for just this last line that brings up some interesting additional ways of looking at where this is headed. Stillness and tranquility restore order in the universe. This would be the Feng in English translation. But again, I don't know why exactly that they translate Tianxia as universe, but that usually means under heaven, or in reference to the world as opposed to everything. But we have this idea then that stillness and tranquility, it has a role of restoring order, which is very interesting. We also have from Chan the translation: by being greatly tranquil, one is qualified to be the ruler of the world. So this is looking again at, from a governing perspective, is there an attribute that's important for how to rightly rule? And this would be bringing out that idea. Then for the final optional, or not optional, but additional translation here, we have, so also attaining clarity and stillness makes you one with the ordering principle of the world. So there's definitely this idea of order that is coming out in this final statement, and that somehow this clarity, or sometimes it's translated as stillness, and Addiss and Lombardo, they translate it as pure, which is a little bit more complicated because it gets into pure tranquility or pure stillness. But I think it's this idea of this clarity, or this stillness, is a good way to look at what's happening here with the how they get to that tranquility. And it has to do then with this order in the universe, or how it should be looked at in terms of ordering, which would be that idea of ruler, or in the case of how you orient yourself to be in harmony with that ordering principle of the universe or of the world. Some very interesting takes on that.
Isn't this kind of similar to the notion that to clarify muddy water, you let it settle? You refrain from stirring it, and it settles of its own accord.
Yeah, I think that could be one of the ways that we can look at this for sure. How do we bring that clarity out of the muddy water is letting it sit by being still. That definitely applies. Oops. Where am I? This is where I'm trying to go.
I think the Feng in English translation, movement overcomes cold, stillness overcomes heat, corresponds with the thermodynamic definition of heat as molecular motion. So
Oh yeah,
cold,
it definitely is something that we can see how it functions, right? Like if I'm cold and I move around, I warm up, and vice versa. I don't think that way of translating those passages would produce something that doesn't make some kind of sense, but it also is something that ends up being like almost obvious. And this is where I'm kind of curious with this approach to how the translation happens, because it brings up, if we're getting to the conclusion of a series of statements that are trying to alert us of the possibility that we're misperceiving the world, either because of limitations or because we've inherited a false expectation, then what do we do with this, right? And so here I think we have a little bit more of a strategy, maybe is the way to put it. Whereas movement overcomes cold, calmness overcomes heat. Yes, but how this is kind of putting it a little bit more into like an action plan, so to speak. It's saying that it's not just that movement overcomes, it's this idea that when that's the focus, or when that is where we're putting all of our energies. So if we think about the misperceptions again, that stuff is unfinished, that it's empty, that it's bent, that it's what was the opposite of the skill one? Clumsy and mute. Then we are in this sense of agitation, that there is this desire that we have to try and figure out what to do, that we have to instill this order, that we have to fix things, right? And we could see this as the general orientation maybe of the West in terms of how we've looked at our natural environment. It's just a collection of things that are there for us to use in order to accomplish something. And, you know, of course, we're starting to see that's not exactly the right way to look at it. But the consequence of that has been a very, in a sense, kind of anxious way of ordering society, where it's definitely based on this idea of scarcity and how do we work to try and secure and protect and change and transform, and that the world, in a sense, needs us to do this because it's incomplete on its own. That's an example then of this agitation going too far, this idea of it overcoming or winning, that then brings about a consequence. And in this case, it's talking about cold, which would be definitely, I think, tying in this idea of winter, right? That winter's coming, like Game of Thrones, right? There's this inverse that happens as a result of that over agitation, where we've gone in kind of this frantic direction because of our misperception of the nature of the situation we find ourselves in. And then in the contrast, then with the tranquility, this could be interesting too, because again, it's got this like extreme. Well, what happens if we go too far in the other direction? Well, what would that mean? Maybe the fact that we are simply not doing anything. Like we've got to the point where, it's going to be what it's going to be, and it's hands off, and I just simply, sit and watch everything happen. Well, that could also have maybe the opposite kind of reaction, right? But that could be seen either as a positive or a negative, because if we're content and we're simply watching how things unfold, then if the hot is this idea of the summer and the spring and summer and its life flourishing, then you could look at this other approach as being beneficial to how that flourishing happens. And if we go back to our misperceptions, we're going to, instead of seeing something as unfinished, we're going to see it as a great accomplishment. Instead of seeing it as empty, we're going to see it as full. Instead of seeing it as bent, we see it as straight and skillful instead of clumsy, and very eloquent versus mute, right? And that's going to bring about a whole different way of being in the world in terms of what we're motivated to do or how we act in the world. And maybe what's being said here is that more calmer approach to understanding the nature of reality and our place in it brings about the summer, right? It brings about that time of flourishing where things can really take off and grow. So then that final statement then about clear and tranquil, the world is in the right mode, can go both ways. It's our being clear and tranquil we're in that participation, maybe like that other translation said, it brings us into alignment with that natural ordering of the world. Or if we're thinking about it in terms of how does one govern, then that governing would come from this clear and tranquil perspective where we're working on how do we help to create a context in which life can flourish, the summer arriving. Or it could simply be that we perceive the world as in the right mode, and therefore we are clear and tranquil because that's how we're looking at the world. Difficult passage to arrive at any final conclusions. There's a lot of different ways that this could go, but I find it a fun chapter because there's a lot of because of all the possibilities. Maybe we'll look at that final set of the conclusions. So the restoring part, I'm a little bit not sure how we would want to look at that, because that would mean that somehow the world, or in their case, the universe, is somehow not where it's supposed to be. And I'm not sure that fits exactly with the Taoist perspective. I think they're like, the Tao is not something you can actually contradict, right? It's going to do what the Tao does, but it's going to have the natural consequences for the actions. And so we can bring things, in a sense, out of balance with that yin yang, which is still the Tao doing what it would normally do as a result of that imbalance. But I can see where this idea of restore would be like, how do we get back into something where it's less of a extreme? And maybe that's part of the idea, is that we bring it into mild fluctuations back and forth instead of extreme fluctuations. And then again, the question about rulership is interesting, but I also really like the idea of makes you one with the ordering principle of the world. I think that
I like the best, I think.
What's that?
I like that one the best of those. Because it's talking about not an absolute principle so much as a state of internal alignment with the external order. Which invokes the concept of personal choice or free will, that you can choose to be aligned with the principle or not.
So then we would get that, again, that strategy or that goal about how do we bring ourselves into alignment with that ordering principle. Yeah, I think that gives a nice way of pulling the chapter together, in that it's not simply an observation that we misperceive, but it's actually got a bit of a strategy involved as well, that recognizing those extremes as a result of the misperception and how to bring that back into alignment with that clarity and that tranquility in order to be more attuned with that actual ordering of the world, so that we see the complete and the full and the straight and the skilled and the eloquence.
Yeah, to me it's really saying, like, don't accept your perceptions as final, and just be aware of that, and don't let your perceptions be what propel you along. Like, you're never going to have the full picture, really, so the more you can accept that fact and be at peace with it, the more you'll be at peace with just the world in general. And you can, it said rule the world, but I think like ruling your own world is really the goal in my head.
Yeah.
And so I think if you can do that, then you can rule your own world with tranquility and stillness.
I like that.
something else that just occurred to me, Jim, is I heard it was a summary of Jung's work. I think like how supposedly how he summarized it was there's a universal ordering principle that sorts based on frequency, something along those lines. The action of the universe is to kind of sort things like with like together, more or less. And also, there's a book, a series of books called My Big Toe, as in Theory of Everything, by a guy named Brian Campbell.
Mm.
That he's a physicist actually. One of the really one of the most compelling ideas from there is he equates it's a theory of everything that kind of blends rationality and mysticism more completely than almost anything I've ever seen. But he equates quality of consciousness with the literal physical quantity of entropy. So a high quality consciousness, one that's refined and evolved, is a consciousness that is lower in entropy, being the physical measure of disorder, more or less.
Interesting.
So this that seems to correspond to this idea that of tranquility and order corresponding to higher quality of consciousness. A parallel.
Yeah. And I think
it's a more orderly consciousness.
I think we can see when we're calmer about a situation, we seem to have more access to like a fuller functioning of our brain, right? Like when we're agitated or in a fearful state, it seems like our way of thinking gets compressed and maybe not as broad. So yeah, I could see that connection between being calm and having more of a fuller way of perceiving and thinking. Yeah, I like how Dane brought that last part in there because it does help us to think about maximizing the use of our minds by recognizing that if we are in a calmer place to begin with, we have access to more of how we can perceive, and that being in that agitated state actually collapses our ability to perceive. So that's a nice connection between what happens with that mismatch between either the biological limitations of perception or the cultural limitations of perception. Both of those relax more and open up more when we're coming from that place of calmness.
Yeah, I find like if you're dealing with an issue that's urgent and you're calm, you can then think about what the next right step is instead of, if you are overwhelmed and you're letting that get to you, you're really focusing on that fact rather than what to do. You're thinking, oh gosh, this is horrible, but not actually thinking about what to do about it.
Yeah.
Well, that, Jim, the manner in which rational thinking and other intellectual faculties become hampered by excitation, particularly like under a fight or flight response under the influence of adrenaline, there's a perceptual narrowing, like literally a vision narrows down to like a tunnel focus. Oftentimes, people like police officers who work in stressful situations, like there will be a gun that goes off somewhere and they don't even hear it because the auditory perception also focuses down. So there's a diminishing of focus and perception. There's a diminishing of like rational thought ability, kind of as a state that can change. You can be either more calm or less calm in any moment. But the correspondence of quality of consciousness with negative entropy is it's more like a stage thing, meaning it's it's not something that goes up and down like this throughout the day. It's something that kind of grows steadily over time. That one can cultivate. In other words, that the orderliness of one's consciousness is something you can kind of develop and grow over time, and that creation of orderliness or negative entropy corresponds to what we think of when we think of a high quality of spiritual consciousness. So it's kind of like the states and stages distinction. There's the state that changes from moment to moment, and then there's the stage you're at, which evolves over time.
Interesting. Yeah, a lot of different ways to explore those differences and find the way to move forward, and it's going to be, excuse me, more helpful for human flourishing, which I think is ultimately the goal here with that idea of the heat or the warm, is that spring, that summer that allows that flourishing to happen. Very good. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And if you've been watching this on video and you'd like to be a part of our live discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe. And you'll get links to our live Zoom presentations on Friday mornings, and also an invitation to our in-person meetings if you happen to be in the Southern California area on Sunday mornings. So thank you again, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, Dan. Thanks.